Huh?
Hmm? Huh.
Welcome to this video where we will be talking about the one and only Peter the Great. And what you may not know about Peter is that he is remembered as one of Russia's best military leaders, and his reformist domestic policy. He transformed the vast expanse of the Russian Empire from an outdated and quite frankly inefficient system to something that truly would have made Alexei one proud daddy. He will forever be remembered as the man who beat Charles XII of Sweden, and the man who took on the might of the Ottoman Empire and was only saved in one case by his wife's jewellery. But we'll get to that later. Peter the Great was born in Moscow 1672 to the then Tsar Alexei and second wife Natalia Narishkina. Peter was a strong boy from an early age and is perhaps best known for his towering height of 6 feet 8 inches, which is well above documented 17th and 18th century averages. Peter had a largely Western education, thanks to his tutors Nikita Zotov and Patrick Gordon. The latter was in fact a Scotsman who had found his way to the Russian army and made a name for himself through solid performances in numerous battles. His influence, paired with Zotov's modern teaching styles of reading, writing, and even battle recreations, led to Peter growing up with his mind set in Western and reformist ways. During later childhood and early manhood, Peter founded the all-joking, all-drunken Synod of Fools and Jesters as an escape from his regal responsibilities, as well as to thoroughly let his hair down. Although this was met with some objection from more orthodox types, Peter simply didn't care and continued the jovialities until his death in 1725. However, Peter's childhood was not all fun and games, as he was in fact scarred for life from an event that took place when he was just 10 years old. In 1682, the Moscow Streltsy regiment revolted against the Narishkins with the aim of putting Peter's older half-sister Sophia on the throne. Over the course of the uprising, Peter saw one of his family's closest advisors, Artemon Matveev, get thrown off a roof, impaled and hacked to pieces by the angry regiment. Consequently, Peter was left with a facial twitch that stayed with him throughout his life. He was also left with a salty taste in his mouth for this faction of the army, as well as for Moscow itself. This can be considered a contributing factor behind his decision to move the capital from Moscow to St. Petersburg. That and the hand he clearly had in the name. This event did lead to Peter's first stint in power though, as he became co-ruler with his half-brother Ivan, with Sophia as regent. Unfortunately, Ivan was a very sickly child and died before he could rule alone, so that responsibility landed with the younger brother, Peter. Peter's love affair with Western ways began at a very young age. Thanks to his tutors, he was able to learn about battles, weapons, and even had a whole life-size recreation of the army at his residence in Preobrazhensky. However, it was not until 1697 that Peter was afforded the opportunity to visit these countries that he so greatly admired. This little vacation was branded the Great Embassy and saw the Russian entourage visit numerous points around Europe, including Riga, where Peter planned to learn about ships, London, where they met Sir Isaac Newton and William of Orange, who gave him a yacht, and also the Netherlands, where he worked as a shipbuilder, all the while being undercover and treated like the other labourers. To some extent, he was still the Tsar. Despite these obvious successes, the embassy actually failed in its principal objective, to secure an alliance against the Ottoman Empire. Neither France nor England were interested in engaging in wartime frivolities from such a distance, and negotiations with Austria and Venice were equally as unfruitful. What's more, the Russian party were forced to cut their stay in Venice due to rumours of a second Streltsy uprising in Moscow, and that was something Peter could never let happen. Despite the obvious failures of Peter's 2-year trip away, he did manage to gain a valuable insight into Europe's education, scientific, and naval systems. This knowledge will prove to be invaluable during Peter's reign. So what did Peter do first? What was his amuse-bouche in this luxurious dinner? He was spoilt for choice for things to change after all. Well, in 1700, Peter modernized the existing Russian alphabet and introduced the Julian calendar to Russia for the first time. 2 years later, he also commissioned the print of Russia's first newspaper, the Vedomosti. However, as you can imagine, not everyone had access to the daily straight away due to the sheer size of Peter's kingdom. For starters, Peter decided to have a crack at reforming the church. With Russia being a very orthodox and almost xenophobic place in the 18th century, this was a big one for Peter, who was no stranger to breaking the church's rules. It was also a major land and serf owner, making it a very rich institution, which Peter could see being a threat to the crown. So, this is what Peter did. After the death of Patriarch Adrian, who had been in this position for 10 years, Peter refused to appoint a new leader. To add insult to injury, the following year, Peter introduced the monastery prikaz, which was the government department responsible for church matters. They also received the monastery's revenue and paid the monks working for the church. Essentially, the church became a sub-department of the state. Peter tightened his grip on religious institutions over time, and by 1721, the church was completely under the control of the government. The clergy became Peter's employees and were tasked with convincing the entire population that the Tsar was a godlike being and could not be touched. Peter 1, Church 0. Next, we move on to Peter's main course, the thing he was most set about changing, and that was the military. On his travels, Peter had been lucky enough to recruit some military captains from abroad, most notably England. He remarked upon the importance of their education and experience, and that was something that was quite foreign to the Russians. Peter set about encouraging the young Russian folk to travel to Europe and gain much of the experience he had during his brief stay. The theory was that this Western education would help to raise the bar of Russian military leaders, which, for a while now, had been pretty low. Peter also hated the traditional Russian dress and made it his business to change. He personally chopped the beards of his advisors to give a more Western appearance and encouraged a more European dressing style. He even introduced a beard tax in 1698 because facial hair offended him so much. But this wasn't enough for Peter. He founded the School of Navigation and Mathematics in 1701 and then the School of Engineering in 1712. He did this in the hope of a more competent generation of Russian leaders, though to begin with these institutions were run by foreigners due to a lack of Russian capability. And now for everyone's favourite course, dessert. For dessert, Peter devoured the economy. Again, much of the reform carried out during this time was a result of Peter's Western travels, where he saw the benefits of a middle or merchant class instead of a state monopoly as was happening in Russia. Peter founded the colleges in 1712, which were based off of a Western model he encountered abroad. There were originally 9, though that number grew over time. They specialised in key areas of the economy, for example in commerce or in navy. And under the state, factories were built to make goods and merchants were encouraged to sell them through private business means, though this attempt ultimately resulted in failure. Peter wanted to culminate a merchant class without giving away any of the privileges the state already had. This resulted in fixed prices, and the state had first choice of goods produced, leaving businessmen with only the leftovers, hence not creating much chance for profit. Finally, for the most disappointing part of any meal, the after-dinner coffee. Peter was not able to reform Russia's agriculture due to the expanse of the country, as well as the traditional beliefs of the inhabitants. He was unable to convince the workers that there were other, more efficient methods to farm the land than a sickle and scythe. What's more, there were very few enforcers of such laws, so nothing revolutionary took place during Peter's reign in terms of ploughing the land. Peter the Great instigated much of the reform that has modernised Russia since the 18th century, thanks to his Western outlook and his close advisors. Despite having been a fun-loving party animal for most of his life, he was still able to create sweeping reforms that affected almost everyone in the giant Russian Empire, most notably the ecclesiastical reforms. To complement this success, Peter also experienced a level of military prowess unlike anything seen before and was able to use his excellent tactical brain to win battles and wars against other major European powers at the time. Thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed. Stay tuned for more.